Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second presentation on jQuery Mobile. The first one, we talked about sort of the out-of-the-box features of jQuery Mobile, but today we're going to go over the API a little bit more in depth. Let's see here. Specifically, we're going to talk about, we're just going to do a quick review of jQuery Mobile itself so that we all start on the same page. Then we'll talk about the events that jQuery Mobile has for us. There's rather a lot of events, and they're pretty useful. The API exposes several methods that you can use in your application. We'll talk about manipulating elements, both before and after initialization. And then we'll talk about configuring the jQuery Mobile framework itself. The framework has a lot of defaults in it, and jQuery Mobile all of those defaults are pretty much completely configurable. Before we do that, though, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the author of O'Reilly's jQuery Mobile book. My background is split pretty much evenly between engineering and agency work. I've done a lot of engineering work on ranging from business applications to genetic analysis software, and then I've also worked with some of the top agencies in the country, including EffectiveUI and Crispin Porter. This gives me a pretty good understanding of what it's like to be out there in the trenches, working with the mobile web and doing the stuff that you folks do on a daily basis. So that's the approach that I try and take when I do this stuff. I recently started a new blog over at Dreamwidth, if you want to take a look at that. There's nothing there right now. I've been busy preparing updates for the jQuery Mobile book and also working on slides and another presentation. But I'm going to start having stuff there soon. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want. And today, last time we did a coding example at the end of the slides, where I basically did a quick jQuery Mobile application. We're not going to have time to actually do a demonstration like that this time. So I took all of the code samples that we're about to look at, and I put them up on GitHub. So if you want to fork that or just copy it, that's the URL for that, and we'll put that in chat later on so that you folks can all be sure and get that if you want them. The examples are pretty simple, but we wanted to go ahead and make sure that you had them. So just as a quick review, jQuery Mobile is a framework. It's built of jQuery plugins and widgets, and it's designed to help you build mobile web applications that have a consistent look and feel across all platforms. It includes several different user interface features, including page transitions. jQuery Mobile handles all of your page transitions for you and handles all of the URL mappings and so forth. And it also includes several interaction features, including touch events, AJAX page loading. So if you have external pages, it will load them into the DOM for you so it can handle page transitions and so forth. One of my favorite things about jQuery Mobile is this slide here. Basically, what you do to work with jQuery Mobile is you write your semantic markup. You apply some HTML5 data attributes to it, and jQuery Mobile does all of the work for you. That's the out-of-the-box functionality of jQuery Mobile, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. To give you a quick example of that. This is a quick example of just a single page in a document, and I'm using the HTML5 tags, so I've got a section, and inside the section I've got a header and a footer and a content area. You can see that the jQuery Mobile custom data attributes are applied to each of those individual areas to tell jQuery Mobile what's a page, what's a header, what's a footer, what's a content area. And then you just load in the jQuery Mobile library, and it does all of the enhancement and markup manipulation for you. And that's the out-of-the-box functionality of jQuery Mobile. That's what we talked about last time. jQuery Mobile has a pretty extensive vocabulary of custom data attributes, and you can do a lot of stuff with those. So if you're of a mind to just to write your semantic markup and manipulate it with just the data attributes, you can do a lot of stuff that way. You can skin your application that way. You can change functionality. You can determine transitions. You can do all kinds of stuff with it that way. And on the jQuery Mobile website, they have a pretty good documentation. There's a page now devoted to just the data attributes. So if you want to work with it that way, that's a perfectly good way of working with it. What we're going to talk about today is using the API, and that gives you a little bit finer control over stuff. You can combine it with the data attributes and get finer control over things, plus do some more complex interactions and so forth. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about events that the API has for you. There's page events, interaction events, and there's even an orientation event that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the methods that the API has available. API has several methods that you can use. There's some useful utility methods that are great to have, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Then we're also going to talk about accessing the jQuery Mobile UI elements after they're initialized and how to handle that. And we'll also talk about configuring the defaults for the framework and how we go about doing that. So let's get started with the events. I wanted to talk about the page events first. These actually help sort of lay the groundwork for how you're going to be interacting with the rest of jQuery Mobile if you're going to be doing heavy scripting. So I wanted to talk about those first. Then we'll get into the cool stuff. So the big thing that people want to talk about usually is the touch events. And jQuery Mobile does have a nice set of touch events, and then we'll talk about those. It also has a set of virtual mouse events to abstract away problems with the mouse in a touch context. And then there's a couple of layout events that we'll talk about as well. So to get started with the page events, jQuery Mobile, because it handles pages in your application so heavily, it has a pretty large vocabulary of events that it publishes as it goes about its business. So we're going to go through those real quick, and then I'll show you an example of how all of these fire and in what order they fire so that you can manipulate them as you need to. So the first thing to bear in mind is the jQuery Mobile initialization events. These get fired off when a page is loaded for the first time, so these are just simple events, and they fire off at different orders. So if you go through and you look through the jQuery Mobile code, you can see where these are actually fired. But basically, what happens is page before create fires after jQuery Mobile obviously is loaded, but before most everything happens. Even if you're just loading in the page, if you've just hit it through a URL, sometimes some of the things aren't even in the DOM yet at this point. But this event fires for that. Then the page create event fires when everything's in the DOM, but jQuery Mobile hasn't manipulated anything yet. So this is when everything's there and available, but jQuery Mobile hasn't done any of its work yet. And then once everything is done, once jQuery Mobile has done all of its initialization to the page, enhanced all of your markup, added all of its stuff that it's going to add, then it fires the page init event. In addition to that, because jQuery Mobile handles page transitions, it also has a set of transition events that it fires off as part of that process. So when you're transitioning from a page to a page, it fires off events, and it fires off a set of events that happen before those transitions, and it fires off a set of events after those transitions. And the events fire on the two different pages. So page before show fires on the page that's being transitioned to before the transition actually happens, and before hide happens on the page that you're transitioning from before the transition actually happens. And then before show fires on the page that you're transitioning to. Let's see here. There we go. Page show fires on the page you're transitioning to after the transition is completed, and page hide fires on the page that you're firing from after the transition is completed. So this gives you a pretty fine control over how you might want to manipulate your pages. I've found the before and after the before and after stuff is pretty useful for getting things off of pages after they've been transitioned away from, or stuff like that. So it's actually really nice to have this kind of fine control over your events and the pages that they access. In addition to that, if jQuery Mobile is loading in a page through AJAX, so if you remember, if you have an external page, jQuery Mobile will fetch it through AJAX, add it to the DOM, and then transition to it. Before it does that, jQuery Mobile will fire off a page before load event. So this is before the AJAX event is actually called, before the AJAX event is actually fired off. Then once the AJAX event is completed, one of two things will happen. Either if there's a failure, it'll fire off an error that'll fire off the page load failed event. And you can bind to that directly if you want. By default, jQuery Mobile will also display an error overlay so that it'll let the user know that there was an error that happened. But if you want to do something a little more user-friendly than that, or maybe try again or something like that, you can use the page load failed event for that. If it's successful, though, then the page load event will happen. Now, with a lot of events, and they fire off in a very specific order. So here I've done a little timeline to sort of help illustrate that, and we'll do another example here in a minute that actually demonstrates this. So in the first case here, in the first event, what we've done is the user has just gone to a page in their browser that's a jQuery mobile page. So they've hit index.html for your application. So the first thing that happens is you can see you've got the page initialization event. So there's page before create, and then the page init event. And then just for the sake of consistency, it does fire off the show events for that page, the page before show and then the page show events. Now, if the user taps on a link to go to another page that's already in the DOM but hasn't been accessed yet, it still has jQuery Mobile will fire off the page initialization events because that page hasn't been initialized yet. And then it'll do the hide and show events that you can see here. So it'll do before hide, before show, and then after the transition, it'll do page hide and page show. Now, if you tap on a link to go to a page that's already been initialized, you've already been to that page, then it'll just do the page transition events. It'll just do before hide, before show, and then page hide and page show. Now, if you're tapping on a link that's going to take you to an external page that hasn't been loaded into the DOM yet and thus hasn't been initialized, then jQuery Mobile will not only fire off all of its page initialization events and the page hide and show events, but it'll fire off the AJAX events that I just talked about. So you can see here this is the longest list. It's got page before load, then you do the page before create, page init. Then the page load event fires, then the hide and show events fire off. The primary reason that we talk about this stuff is because one of the main things that you learn when you first start working with jQuery is when to actually start accessing elements in the DOM, and you bind to the document ready event and have an event handler that does most of your jQuery scripting. In this case, because jQuery Mobile handles the pages for you, you have a slightly different paradigm for that. So instead of binding to document ready in a jQuery Mobile application, you're going to want to bind to page init for most of your first load purposes, like if you're applying event handlers on the page or something like that. Page init fires for every page the first time you go to it, and so that's a good analog for document ready. If you want to do things to a page every time you go to it, not just the first time, but every time, then you'll want to use the show events. Those fire every time, including the first time. So as you're binding to your page show events and your page initialization events, you want to be careful of the order that they happen in. And also make sure to remember that the page show events fire every time, including the first time that you go to a page. So you wouldn't want to probably bind your event handlers in a page show event, for example, unless you're using a one-shot event handler or something like that that's going to unbind itself after it's called. So to illustrate that, I have an example here. I don't know if you folks, I hope you can see this code here. Like I said, all of this is available up on GitHub if you want to take a look at it. But basically, I've got a simple jQuery Mobile page here. I've got two sections. One's a regular page, and the other one's a pop-up that we can use just to sort of demonstrate how to sort of demonstrate page transitions to an existing page. In the main page, I've got a link that you can tap that'll show the dialog, and then there's another link that you can tap that'll load in an external page through Ajax and insert that into the DOM. So we can demonstrate both of these things. And then in the script, basically all I'm doing is I'm just binding to every single one of those event handlers. And inside of each event I'm binding to every single one of those events, and inside of the handler, I'm just logging to the console what the event was. Just a straightforward, one after the other, easy to follow example. There's nothing special going on here. I did use event delegation. If you're not familiar with that process of delegating events, jQuery has, if you go to the jQuery documentation site, not the jQuery mobile site, but jQuery itself, if you look at the documentation for their on method, which is the new way they have for binding events, you can see I'm using it here. They have a couple of good paragraphs that I think explain event delegation pretty well. So if you're a little fuzzy on that, go ahead and that's a good place to start. There's also lots of blog posts about JavaScript event delegation. So it's an important technique, and it's something that you're going to be needing to use a lot in your jQuery mobile application. So in this case, I've delegated a lot of these to the section, so that as new sections get added to the DOM, my events will fire even for things that aren't there when I actually initialize my events. So and so when we actually load this example into the browser, if we just go to example1.html, you can see here I've got a screenshot, and I've loaded this into just Chrome on my desktop. So I'm not actually using a real mobile browser, but I wanted to have access to the console so that we could easily see a screenshot of the console and see what the actual events are in the order that they're firing in. So if you go to just example1.html and you load it in your browser, you can see it fires off the page initialization events before create, and then page create, and then page init, and then it fires off the show events for that first page. If you tap on the show dialog, it will go ahead and show the dialog, and then you can see, since the dialog is a new page, we haven't been to it yet, it fires off the page initialization events for the dialog, so page create, page init, so forth. Then it does the transition events, just like we expected. Now, if we tap on the X to close the dialog, we'll essentially be transitioning back to a page that we've already been to. So all we'll see are the page hide and show events. This page has already been initialized. We did that before. So this is a good example of how the page hide and show events fire every time you go to a page. Now if we tap on our Go to Page 2 link, which will load in something through an Ajax call, load in our external page through an Ajax call, this will go ahead and fire off all of the events, and it'll fire off the Ajax calls, and then it'll fire off the page initialization events, and then it'll fire off the page hide and show events. So this is sort of a good illustration of how all of these events work and the order that they fire in. And you can bind to any of these in your scripts, but probably most often you're going to be using the page init event as your document ready analog for each page. That's probably the one you're going to be going to. But there are a lot more, and I wanted you to be aware of them because it's nice to have this kind of fine control over the initialization events and the hide and show events in your application. So now we can talk about the cool stuff. Since we've laid the groundwork for actually being able to do that, let's talk about the touch events now. So jQuery Mobile has a set of simple touch events that you can use. You can bind to them just like you would any other kind of a mouse event or anything like that. You can pick an element and you do your bind event handler to tap or any of these, and you bind to it just like you would any other event. The events are pretty straightforward. Tap is a quick tap on the element. Tap hold is a touch and hold. It's just under a second, I think. If you touch and hold for just under a second, the tap hold will fire. Tap is a quick touch and up. So tap hold won't fire a tap first and then tap hold. You'll just get a tap hold because in order for a tap to fire, you have to have the touch up event. A swipe is a horizontal swipe, so less than 20 pixels of vertical movement, a horizontal drag of 30 pixels or more, and that's in either direction. Swipe is either left or right, and then we have specific swipe left and swipe right events. And like I said, you can bind to these just like you would anything else. So here's an example where we've modified our previous page so that instead of having a link that you tap to display the dialog, you just swipe anywhere inside of that first page. I've bound the swipe event, bound a listener to the swipe event on that page, and it will go ahead and show the dialog. This is pretty straightforward. Obviously, it's hard to show this in a screenshot, but it does work. If you load example 2, you can go ahead and swipe anywhere in that page, including the header or the footer, because those are all included in the section area, and it's the section that's listening to the swipe event. So that's a good demonstration of how to do that. And you can see I'm just using the same syntax that we use for any of our other events to bind to the swipe event. As I mentioned, jQuery Mobile also has a set of abstracted virtual mouse events. These are convenience events that fire off to sort of help. It helps sort of fix some of the problems that you might encounter with platform dependencies and even version dependencies within platforms. So there's event order issues. How each individual platform synthesizes its individual events can be a little different, and even different from, as I said, different from version to version and so forth. So anyway, these events provide a way to sort of gloss over all of those problems, and you can bind to these just like you would anything else. In a situation where you have an application that's going to be using both mouse events and touch events. If you want to have a situation like that, I know that's quite frequent where you're repurposing one application in both a desktop and a touch environment as well. There's just one thing to remember, excuse me, when you're actually using these virtual mouse events. There can be some problems with them if you have a situation, and this happens occasionally. I've had this happen to me occasionally in my projects. If you are in a situation where you're trying to do a click event and it's what the event handler is doing is dependent upon the content that's underneath the mouse at the time the click event fires, sometimes because of the way different platforms fire their synthetic events, it can be things can get out of order and you can have some unpredictable results. You can have things not being quite where you're expecting them or something along the lines. So if you're having and it's typically a platform-dependent problem. Like it'll work in some of my platforms, but in some of my other platforms it isn't working. So as I'm doing my testing, I find strange things like that. The easiest way to fix it is to just bind a click instead of vclick, because that's straight up that. That's the solution that's recommended by the jQuery Mobile team. I've also found that if you don't care about event propagation, you can delegate your listeners to parent elements, and that seems to help too. It kind of depends upon your situation, but this is sort of a rare gotcha, but it happens. It happened enough to me that I thought it was important to just go ahead and call your mind to it. Like I said, the symptom is you have a situation where you're binding to a click event. It's most often a click event, and you're just getting some unpredictable behavior with the content that's involved with your click event. You might not run into it, and you might not have this problem, in which case, great, you don't have any issues there. But I wanted to call it out in case it's something that happens. There are a couple of other events that you can bind to. There's a scroll start and scroll stop, which fire when the user starts scrolling, and then the scrolling stops. Now, one thing to bear in mind with the scroll stop event, most mobile devices have eased scrolling. So as you scroll, it starts off very fast and then gradually slows down and then stops. The stop event doesn't fire until it completely stops. So if you're in a situation where you have a long list that the user is scrolling through, and typically users will kind of flick interaction. They'll have a flicking interaction. They'll flick through the scrolling. That scroll stop event won't fire until the user stops until they stop scrolling. So if they do if it slows down to a point and then the user flicks it again, the scroll stop event will not fire at that point. It'll still be scrolling, and the scroll stop event won't have fired. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're handling your user interactions with scrolling. And there's also a thing with mobile Safari where they won't allow DOM manipulations while scrolling is happening, so that's kind of a bummer too. Not really anything to be done about that, I don't think, but that's something to bear in mind in mobile Safari. As jQuery Mobile adds pages to the DOM through AJAX, that you can imagine that could cause some memory problems. You could add more and more pages and get more and more elements in the DOM, and could be quite complex. So jQuery Mobile will remove dynamically added pages from the DOM, and when it does, to help solve these memory problems. And when it does that, it'll fire a page remove event that you can bind to. So sometimes you might want to do that, so that's a good one to do. The update layout event is fired whenever one of the jQuery Mobile widgets updates itself or something like that. So you can bind to that. And then, but the one that's actually kind of cool is the orientation change event. So this is when the user changes the orientation of their device from portrait to landscape or back again. This is a nice little event that you can bind to, and you can determine what the orientation is. And this is a quick little example to sort of demonstrate that. In our case, when you're in landscape mode, you have a little bit more width, so we might want our header and footer to have a little bit more information in them than they are when they're in portrait mode. I just bound an event listener to the document, and I check and see which mode we're in, and if we're in the wider mode, I go ahead and make the header and footer a little bit wider, and if we're in the narrower mode, I make the header and footer a little bit shorter. I don't necessarily, this is an illustration example. I don't know that you would necessarily want to do this. Probably a better way of doing it would be with either CSS classes or having a nice fluid layout to start with. But this is a nice sort of shortcut for getting to this stuff, and the event is there if you need to be able to kick off things. Sometimes you want to hide and show different things depending upon your orientation and so forth. And so this is a nice event that you can bind to that will give you that capability. Here I've actually had to load the example 3 into my mobile device. Obviously, your average desktop browser doesn't support portrait versus landscape and doesn't fire off those events. So if you're working with these examples, you will actually need to load example 3 into a mobile device or into an emulator that supports portrait and landscape events in order to actually be able to see it work. So just FYI on that if you actually get the code and you're working with it. Now, that's all the events. So we can talk about the methods that the jQuery Mobile exposes for you to use. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're actually most of them are convenience routines, but there's a couple of page manipulation ones. They're actually pretty useful. But first, I want to call out we're going to see a slightly unusual syntax which you might not have seen in your jQuery development. Typically, in jQuery development, you're calling methods on a jQuery selector. So you basically call a selector. You basically call the method directly on the selector. But many of these convenience routines don't need a selector. You don't need to do that. So they're just methods that you call directly on the mobile object. So you'll see a slightly different syntax for them, and that's the explanation for that difference in syntax. I used this method. So these are some page methods. I used the change page method in the previous example where we manually showed the dialog in the swipe event. And basically all this does is this just gives you a way to programmatically change the page. You can feed into it all sorts of information about whether it's a dialog, what sort of a transition you want, et cetera, et cetera. If the page that you're telling it, what the URL is, if the URL is for an external page, then change page will call load page, which actually loads the page into the DOM for you. So change page will handle everything everything for you directly. And so if you want to go back and see an example of that, you can take a look at example 2. In addition, there's a couple of methods that you can call for showing the page loading page loader, which is just a little layover that has it says loading by default and has a little spinny on it. And you can hide and show that manually. So if you're doing something, like for instance, communing with a service or something, and you want to give the user the feedback that there's something going on, you can go ahead and manually handle this way. I actually use those all the time. They're actually really convenient to have access to. In addition to that, there's a couple of other methods that you can use. There's a silent scroll, which you just basically give it a pixel value, and it will scroll the page to that point. And it's silent because it doesn't trigger the scroll events that we just talked about. So it gives you an opportunity to work around those things. If you have toolbars, we talked a little bit about toolbars in the last webcast. You can manually show and hide them this way if you want. So you can change the interaction that way if you want, or work with them manually if you need to. And then you can also get a reference to the currently active page using the active page method if you want to, and access it that way. And then the utility methods there's several of them. The big one to remember is if you're like me and you use the jQuery data method. I love the jQuery data method. I think it's a brilliant thing. I love being able to attach arbitrary data to elements, and it's something that I do a lot. But because jQuery Mobile makes heavy use of data attributes, you don't want to use the base jQuery data methods. You want to use the jQuery Mobile data methods, mostly because that way you'll be in a position to support namespace data attributes. Even if you're not namespacing your data attributes, this is a good habit to get into. These are the methods that the framework provides to access that feature. And if you're going to be using the framework, you should go ahead and use these, even though it's a little bit different. But the syntax is exactly the same as the regular jQuery data, and they have exactly the same functionality. It's just that they have an extra added support for namespacing. So that's an important thing. And then there's several utility methods for dealing with paths and URLs. If any of you have ever actually written any of these things from scratch, you'll appreciate how useful these are. These are all extensions of the path object on the mobile object, so you'll be seeing them as methods on that. So the first one that's really useful is parse URL. So if you give that a URL, it will parse it and return an object that has properties that correspond to the various components of the URL. So you can get the host name, the authority, which is an object, and you can also get just the username and password. You can get the port. I mean, it gives you just about everything you can imagine from a URL in a nice, easy to handle format. So if you've ever written scripts to this, you'll appreciate how nice it is to have something like this handy for you to just use already. And then there's some other stuff for comparing whether or not two URLs are in the same domain. You feed it two URLs and it'll return true if they're in the same domain. There's determining whether a particular URL is relative or absolute. Determining you can make a absolute path or URL out of a relative one. I mean, these are nice convenience routines. I don't think I've ever used them, but they're there and they're available. Here's an example where we're using the page loading method. So where we're hiding and showing the page loading methods. I just basically took our previous example that we had, and then when the user changes their orientation, I show the page loading event, manipulate the content, and then hide the page loading dialog rather. And that goes ahead and handles. It gives the user a little bit of feedback that something's going on there. This is, again, just an example for illustration purposes. Obviously, this text manipulation is really super fast, so you probably wouldn't even see the dialogue. This would be more useful if you were actually like going and getting the new content from the server, for example. But this is an illustration of how you would use those methods and how convenient they are to actually have. It's nice to be able to have that kind of access in your scripts to give the user that kind of feedback. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is each individual element in jQuery is built on many of them are built on the jQuery UI widget pattern, if you're familiar with that. So if you're familiar at all with jQuery UI, you know there's lots of different widgets over there. There's the calendar picker, which is awesome. There's the accordion widget, which I use frequently. You know, there's several things over there, and they're all built using a particular pattern, a particular factory of code. And many of the jQuery mobile widgets are built using that particular widget pattern. So just like the jQuery UI widgets having methods that you can call after they're initialized, you can do the same thing here. So you can actually access initialized, you can actually manually initialize these widgets yourself, and you can access them after they're initialized. So, for example, probably one of the most obvious ones is the list view. jQuery Mobile has a really complex and useful list view plugin that enhances a basic list, and you can initialize it with a data attribute if you want, or you can manually initialize it using the list view method. You just simply take your selector and apply the list view method to it, and it will go ahead and initialize for you. And then if you're manipulating your list view after initialization, you can, for example, if you've gone to the server and added more things to the list view and you want them to be formatted properly, then you can call the refresh method on that previously initialized list view. If you call the refresh method on a list view, it will only refresh items that haven't been initialized yet. That's for efficiency purposes. So, and which actually makes it pretty fast. So if you have a really long list and you add 2 things to it, don't worry, it won't have to reinitialize the whole list and take a whole bunch of time. It'll only initialize those 2 things. So that's good to know. So here's an example. I just took a simple page, and you can see in my content area I've got a paragraph, which I'm actually going to just wholesale. I'm just going to replace it with an unordered list that I'm going to load from the server in a load command. And so you can see here I've bound to the page init event. I've just bound an event handler that's going to go and do a load call from the server. It's going to take that stuff and it's going to take that unordered list and stuff it right into my content area. And then when it's done, I'm going to call the list view method on it, and you can see the result right there is exactly what you would expect. So it gives a nice the list view method is nice because it gives you direct access to the list views directly. And the list view isn't the only one that has that. There's several other ones, particularly the form elements, which get automatically enhanced in jQuery UI. And so if you want to access form elements, you can go ahead and do that. You can use these methods to manually toggle checkboxes and radio buttons. You can select items in the select menus and toggle your switches and move your sliders. Checkboxes and radio buttons both use the checkbox radio plugin. Selects use the select menu plugin. And sliders and switches both use the slider plugin. They're both initialized from the slider plugin. So if you want to access your forms directly, perhaps as the user is going through and filling out something and you want to, make things, change some other things, this is the way you would go ahead and do that. And then the last thing we want to talk about really quickly here is configuring jQuery Mobile. Now, the jQuery Mobile framework has a lot of defaults. You can see it's got a lot of defaults for everything from page transitions to name spacing of your data attributes, all of these things. And there's a whole huge API that jQuery that is exposed for you so that you can customize this to your needs. The trick about jQuery Mobile configuration, though, is you have to do your configuration before jQuery Mobile is loaded. Obviously, if you do it after jQuery Mobile is loaded, it's too late. jQuery Mobile has already used its defaults. So you have to write. So basically, what you do to sort of get around that is you write a script. You load your script that does your configuration, and you load that after you load in jQuery, but before you load in jQuery Mobile. And then inside of that script, you bind an event handler to the mobile init event, and then inside of that event handler, you go ahead and do your changes. So an easier way it's just easier to show this. Here I've created a simple file called JQM. JQM customized.js, I think is what I can't hardly see my own writing here. But anyway, the top example is I'm just binding is in the file itself, where I'm just binding to the mobile init event, and I'm changing the loading message to, which is by default loading ... I'm changing it to hold on a sec, and I'm changing the default transition from which defaults to slide, and I'm changing it to pop. Which isn't really a good choice, but this is just a point of an example. You can change these things directly on the object itself, or you can extend the object using the jQuery extend method. This is in the commented out code here. This is exactly the same thing done with an object literal. This is a nice method that you can use. For example, if you want to let users customize their applications, you can go ahead and store their customizations as a JSON object and then load that in yourself. So that's a nice convenient way of handling that. And you can see in my head here in the document itself, I load in jQuery, then I load in my customizer JavaScript, and then I load in jQuery Mobile itself, and it goes ahead and executes everything in order and handles everything correctly. So that's how you do that. Now I'm not going to go over all of the different stuff that's available to be customized. That's documented well on the jQuery Mobile site, so there's really no need for me to go over it. But if you have something that you wish, the big things to remember are like default transition. You can do your data attribute namespacing. You might want to, in previous versions of jQuery Mobile, they had it set up so that it would automatically add a back button as you went through pages, and that's turned off by default, but that's a configurable option now, I believe. So if you want, go and take a look at those things, and this is how you configure them. It's pretty straightforward. You just flip the values. This is a good way, for example, to localize your default messages. You might want to localize the default messages for your loading messages and error messages and so forth. This is a good place this is the place where you would go ahead and do that. So that's the jQuery Mobile API in depth there. We've covered the events that you can bind to. There's page events, interaction events like touch events and virtual mouse events, and there's even an orientation event that you can bind to. We've talked about manipulating pages with the methods that you've exposed, that the jQuery Mobile API exposes. There's also some nice utility methods that you can use for checking your URLs and so forth. We've talked about how to access elements after initialization and how to manually initialize them as well. And we've talked about how to configure the framework. Like I said, out of the box, jQuery Mobile works really great with its data attributes. You can do a lot of this stuff with straight-up data attributes. So if you were of a mind to just want to write semantic markup and handle things with the data attributes, that's a perfectly good way of handling it, and jQuery Mobile will do a really good job for you. You really don't need to write a single line of scripting if you want. But if you have something that's an edge case, something that's a little more complex, maybe you want to have some more complex interactions, or your application needs a little bit more than just what jQuery Mobile provides out of the box. The API will give you access to just about everything that you need. That, in combination with a good solid knowledge of event handling and so forth, will give you everything that you need to be able to build awesome web applications with jQuery Mobile. So that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and take some questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope this was helpful. Like I said, if you want, you can get the sample code from GitHub. We put the URL up earlier, and it's pretty straightforward stuff. There's nothing terribly complicated. As I mentioned in the README, some of the code samples you can load directly into your browser just by loading them as files. Some of them you will need to, anything that does an AJAX call, for example, you'll need to access through a web server. Local AJAX calls typically don't work in many browsers. So you'll need to do that. And then the one example that does orientation change, that demonstrates orientation change, you'll need to either load that into a mobile device that supports orientation change or into an emulator that supports orientation change. But otherwise, the examples are pretty straightforward. They're not complicated. I didn't want to get too complicated with them because I didn't want to obscure the basics. So let me take some questions here. We've got some good ones. So I've not had success inserting dynamic content. What are the best practices for inserting dynamic non-AJAX content? It sort of depends upon what you're trying to do. Now, when you insert, so as you know, jQuery Mobile, when you load a page, it fires off all of its page initialization events. It goes through and it initializes a page. If you insert more content into the page after that's done, obviously, if it's something that you want jQuery Mobile to initialize, then you'll need to reinitialize it. You can reinitialize it either by manually calling one of the API methods on it for like a list view or for one of the form elements, or you can cause jQuery Mobile to completely reinitialize the entire page again. That could be kind of expensive. It's probably better to figure out exactly what specifically you need to initialize and handle it that way. Typically, you would do those on. You would need to make sure that you did those. Obviously, you would want to make sure that you did those initializations after the content was inserted in the DOM and available. That can be kind of tricky if you're generating it on the fly and not using an AJAX call, which will give you automated callbacks. So that can be a little bit tricky, but there are ways around that. You can listen for document change events and so forth. So I don't know that there's necessarily some best practices around that, but those are the paths that I would look at while I was trying to solve those problems. And I've had similar problems like that myself, where I'm like, okay, I've got some new form elements that I want to insert, and like a login form or something, and I want it to look nice, but you just insert it into the DOM after jQuery Mobile has done its initialization events, and it'll look just like a regular form. It doesn't look like the nice jQuery Mobile form. So, you can go ahead and call the form methods on those elements, and they will go ahead and be initialized as you would expect. So next question, is it possible to change the graphic for show page loading? Yes, it is. I think there's even a configuration option for it, but if there isn't, you can always access it through CSS. If you look at the markup that gets generated when jQuery Mobile does its initialization, it'll insert the page loading page into your DOM, and you can take a look at your generated HTML and get the CSS class, and then just overwrite it with whatever you need, because I believe they use a background image on that. So that's what I've done in the past to change it to be instead of being the little spinny thing, to be a set of dots and stuff like that. So yes, it's totally possible to do that. Like I said, I think there's a configuration option for it. If there isn't, you can go ahead and overwrite it with CSS. It's pretty easy to do. Is it possible to lazy load some pages on jQuery Mobile? Well, jQuery Mobile does kind of do that for you. If you have a set of minimal pages in your starting document, and then you link off to other pages, jQuery Mobile will load them in only as the user requests them. You can cache those too. That's another thing that you can do with a data attribute on those links, if you would prefer. But that is sort of handled by the framework for you. I'm not sure if that's specifically what if by lazy loading you mean load only on demand, or if you mean lazy loading as in load only once needed, and then as the user is doing other stuff, not necessarily clicking on links to go to other pages, you load in stuff behind the scenes. If that's what you mean, you can do that. You apply a data attribute to your URL that tells it to go ahead and load those into the DOM, even if the user hasn't tapped on them yet. It will go ahead and do that. If you do that, bear in mind that you are inserting things into the DOM behind the scenes, and that can cause memory and efficiency problems. So just watch out for that on some of the older devices. That can be a little problematic. So watch out for that. I hope that answers your question. I wasn't 100% sure what you meant by that. Next question: does the tap event fire quicker than click? which waits approximately 300 milliseconds in an instance where you'd recommend using tap instead of click. So this is one of those implementation-specific situations. Yes. Sometimes the tap event fires quicker than click. It depends on how the actual It depends upon how the actual browser will synthesize the click event based on a tap. So typically I'm interested in tapping events if I'm on a mobile device, and so if I'm building a mobile application, I'm typically building just an application for a mobile context, and so I'll just bind to my tap events and not worry about the click events because all I'm really interested in are the tap events. So that's my way. That's sort of my way of sort of doing an end run around this problem. But yeah, if you're in a situation where you have a concern for this can be a problem. And like I said, I mentioned when I was talking about this, if you are having problems with your click events, because the synthesized click events after a tap do show up a little bit later, you can have problems trying to get your coordinates or trying to get your content or something like that. Yeah, you can have some problems with that. In which case, you can try using jQuery Mobile's virtual events. They can help get you around these problems, or you can bind directly to click if those aren't helping. So if you are having some dependency problems with that, some platform dependency problems with that, that's probably the way I would go. But typically I'm happy just using the tap events and not worrying about clicks because the tap events are really all I'm concerned about. Let's see here. For example, one. Triggering the external HTML gave me an origin as null, not allowed by access control allow origin error. Is there a setting to allow it? So the problem that you're having is you probably tried to load in example 1 just as a file. And if you try and do an AJAX call from a file, you will run across the browser's single origin security issue. So what you actually need to do is serve example 1 from a server. So if you want to use XAMPP for that, that's actually my favorite solution for it. MacBooks come with their, Apples come with their own web server and so forth, or you can use IIS on your Windows machines. But that's what your problem is there. If you tried to load in example1.html just as a file and you try and do an AJAX call, you'll run across the single origin security issue there, and that's exactly what that is. If you load it in as a file, if you load it in from a web server, it'll work correctly. Total newbie question: why shouldn't I use jQuery Mobile everywhere? Because not everything is a mobile application. You would seriously. I think that's a good question, and seriously, I think the answer to that is you would only use it in applications that you intend to be mobile enabled. You'll probably be building plenty of websites that you're not going to be worried about that, and you wouldn't use jQuery Mobile for that. If you have websites that you are going to be worried about that, then I think jQuery Mobile is a good choice for that. There are other choices. There's plenty of other frameworks. jQuery Mobile is a nice one to get you up and running quickly, but there are plenty of other frameworks too. So don't limit yourself there. Even though obviously I'm a huge fan of jQuery Mobile. I hope that answered your question. Because I think that's a good question. Let's see here. Lots of JQM stuff uses live, but jQuery deprecated that in a few versions back. Yes. Is there a backup plan for this as it relates to jQuery Mobile? Yes, live's been deprecated. You should be using the new on binder that is part of jQuery 1.7. I haven't checked the jQuery Mobile code itself to see if they've gone through and started and replaced live with on. I should check that. I'm sure they will because that's, if they haven't already, I'm sure they will. So the documentation might take a little bit longer to catch up. If you look at the jQuery Mobile documentation online, they use live for a lot of things. They use bind for a lot of things. Live will be live and bind and everything. They'll be around for a little while, so it's not a major problem. But everybody should be switching over to the new on method for binding things. Obviously, they're going to have to be careful about that if they have people who are on older versions, who are stuck on older versions of jQuery, but want to use the latest version of jQuery Mobile. If they're on an older version of jQuery that doesn't have on, but they want to use the latest version of jQuery Mobile that only uses on instead of live, obviously that can cause some problems. So we'll have to watch out for that. I think those are probably edge cases, though. But we will have to watch out for that as a community. But yeah, I think the documentation will probably take the longest to catch up if that's specifically what you're asking about. For any projects you're starting now, obviously I think you should be using on to do all of your event binding, because that's what we're going to be using going forward. Another question, if I want to use the show page loading message as early as possible, when should it be called? As early as possible in which particular event flow would be my question for that. So if you remember when we were talking about the page initialization events, jQuery Mobile does fire off a set of page initialization events, and they happen. So review that and take a look and see which one of those matches up with what you're calling to be the earliest. At the very earliest, if you want. And I've done this. This is sort of an end run around this. jQuery Mobile, as part of its initialization process, will insert the page loader div into your markup really early on as it's doing its initialization. Now the CSS by default has it set to hide, so it's the display is set to none on that. You can override that in your own CSS if you want. If you make a more specific CSS selector that overrides their specificity, you can set that to display block if you want, and it will go ahead and show up as soon as it's in the DOM. So that's the absolute soonest you'd be able to get it to show up if you use that method. Then you'd have to manually toggle your CSS class. You'd have to manually handle your CSS to take care of that, but that's definitely a solution. I've done that. It's a little heavy-handed. It's probably better to show it using one of the by binding to one of the page events that I was mentioning earlier on. So probably the soonest. Well, obviously it would be there by the time page init happens, but by the time page init happens, everything's already there. So you'd probably want to do one of the earlier page events. You wouldn't. Yeah, that's probably the case. And it depends upon the situation. If you're doing an AJAX call, you could do it on the before load event. That would go ahead and handle that okay. It's like I said, it's kind of hard to say. You could do page create. Instead of page init, like I said, page init fires after all of the individual things are already there, so it's probably too late. Page before create is probably too soon because I don't think the loader's even there yet. Page create, I think the loader is probably there by then, and you could try binding to that and see if that does it. That'd probably be the earliest of the events that you could do just from a straight up load. And that's just for if you're just typing, going to index.html, that very first load of your page, of your application page. Now, if you're actually loading in something through the DOM, you can go through, or loading in something through AJAX and it gets inserted into the DOM, you can go ahead and use one of the AJAX methods that gets that fires off the AJAX method, the event that fires off before the AJAX call actually happens. You could do that. If you're otherwise just talking about regular transitions from page to page, you can use the page hide and show events to do that. So it kind of depends upon what your situation is. If you're looking, as I would guess, you're looking to have something like as soon as anything is, like you go to index.html in your browser, and as soon as anything's displayed on the page, you want that loading thing to show up. I'm guessing that's what you're after. And in that case, I think probably your best bet would be to try binding to the page create event for that, and see if it can handle that for you. And if that's not soon enough, you can try overwriting the CSS for that and doing it yourself. That would get it there absolutely as soon as possible. That covers all of our questions. I hope you folks found this to be useful. Once again, you can get the code samples from GitHub if you like, and we are in the process of updating the book too, because when we wrote it, it was about a year ago, and obviously significant changes have been made in jQuery Mobile since then. So we'd like to get updates out there that does justice to the jQuery Mobile team, because they do really awesome work, and we want to make sure that everybody knows about it and has good access to information about it. So thank you all very much, and that concludes our presentation.